And welcome to Political Trade Secrets. This is the live stream edition. We're streaming all across the internet on 12 to 15 different platforms. So wherever you are, thank you, welcome. And while we're doing the show, please post questions, comments, and join the conversation. Today, we're talking about the legal battles shaping American politics with a special guest, Republican attorney, constitutional election attorney, Chris Murray. He's the founder of First and 14th, a boutique legal practice helping all sorts of causes. And what we do in this episode is we tackle some of the big issues: the Minnesota immigration enforcement, the Insurrection Act. What's the legal basis for that? We talk about redistricting and gerrymandering, and in particular how the SCOTUS decision potentially coming up on racially drawn congressional districts, how that could affect things. Also, including illegal aliens in the census, which is something that currently happens, which is crazy. But we talk about that and how that could possibly change, what's the legal basis for that. And then really important, how lawyers can help with election day legal operations. And that's something that we discuss, and how that works, how to protect your voters on election day and protect your vote. Also, how election lawyers in both Republican and Democrat spheres are organized differently and how that shows up. And of course, all the lawfare. One of the most interesting things I think we talk about is the shadowy dark money group called the 65 group that has been targeting Republican attorneys across the country for disbarment and making bar complaints, all frivolous, but ultimately to cause them problems and to keep them out of the electoral process. So more of that on this upcoming episode of Political Trade Secrets. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Political Trade Secrets, an inside look at campaigns and politics, where we pull back the curtain, look under the hood, and investigate all aspects of politics and how elections are won. Now, here's your host, Dustin Olson.
Pollster and host of the Political Trade Secrets podcast, Dustin Olson.
Dustin Olson.
Dustin Olson.
And Dustin Olson, pollster at American Pulse. They work for both Republicans and Democrats. And he hosts a podcast, Political Trade Secrets. Oh, we love that. We like that podcast.
Now, from Washington, D.C., is pollster Dustin Olson.
And welcome to Political Trade Secrets. I'm your host, Dustin Olson. Thank you for sharing your day with us today, and for your interest in pulling back the curtain and learning how politics really works. And today, we're going to be talking about how if you are in politics, you probably need a lawyer at some point these days, and it's becoming more and more important if you are navigating campaigns or big political issues in the country. More and more, this is an important part of the whole process, from lawfare to court cases to executive orders. Everything seems to have a legal angle these days, and that's why I'm excited to have our guest, Chris Murray, who I will be talking about in just a moment. But wherever you are watching this program, listening to it, please do like, follow, and subscribe, whether it's YouTube, it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever it is. It really does help the show to follow and subscribe, and we do appreciate that. Also, something I want to tell you about that is new. We are launching the the polling club community. So a lot of folks who are fans of the show have joined our polling club newsletter, where we at American Pulse, we share some of our own polling plus analysis and insights from other people's polling to help you navigate all the news stories, what public opinion really is within the country, and definitely want you to check that out so you can get all that information. You can help us decide what the next poll that we conduct will focus on, what questions we want to ask. So you can go to pollingclub.com to sign up for that. But without further ado, I'd like to tell you about our great guests that we're going to have here momentarily. Chris Murray, I've known him for years. He's been my own legal counsel on numerous occasions, and I would put him as one of the top political lawyers in the country in issues of constitutional law, First Amendment issues, and really election-related issues, and that's why we look to him. And in particular, he is one of the top lawyers on the Republican side. He's his firm, which we'll be talking about, First and 14th, actually represents all three of the major Republican campaign committees, and was important in actually representing the Republican National Committee on the J6 committee, I believe. We'll ask him about that. His background: he's a graduate of the Harvard Law School. He is clerked for Judge Timkovich on the 10th Circuit, and was Deputy General Counsel for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, as well as Deputy General Counsel for the Trump transition back in 2016 and early 2017. So a breadth of knowledge, and I'm looking forward to talking to him about some important issues facing the country right now and the legal side of it, as well as what anybody who's a campaign practitioner might need to know about the legal side of campaigns and politics. So without further ado, on with the show. Chris Murray, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Hey, Dustin, good to be with you. How are you?
I'm doing great, and I've been looking forward to having this conversation for some time. I've enjoyed seeing your media appearances. I've been watching for the last, half year or so. You've been out there providing a lot of legal insight as to important issues. And in a minute, I'd like to get into your background. But the first thing as we have this conversation right now, Minnesota and Minneapolis in particular are just kind of lit on fire with activity. And it seems like we're barreling towards the possibility of the Insurrection Act being invoked. So what's your take on the whole Minnesota situation currently?
Well, and so my overall take before we go into lawyer mode is that it's a complete disaster, and that unfortunately there are elements up there. And again, like, you can think whatever you want about ICE, right? You can think whatever you want about immigration laws in this country and their enforcement. But there's elements up there who are, I think, using well-meaning people as pawns and getting them to take risks with their own lives, putting themselves in the way of federal law enforcement activity that's, completely legitimate, even if some of the tactics are heavy-handed. And they're trying to put these people between ICE officers and their duty. And there's already been tragic results with it, and I hope there's not any more of that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Well, this is what you get when you have law enforcement locally who should be working alongside ICE, but it seems like all-out rebellion where they are actually actively, in some cases, working against them. That seems very different than what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I would be willing to bet, right, that most of those local law enforcement folks don't like being put in that position. They're in that position because of political choices that are being made by their principals. And again, look, Minnesota's a blue state. It's got a right to be a blue state. You don't have to like the immigration laws in this country, but there's something that you're supposed to do. Elect a new Congress, right? You might need a new president in 3 years if that's what you want, and convince the American people that we should let anybody that wants to come into the country. I think that's a hell of a hard sell. But if that's what you want, you've got to try and change the law. Don't try and stop law enforcement officers who are just doing their job from enforcing it.
Yeah. Well, with us tracking public opinion, one thing that's been remarkable to me, I was, when we started talking about mass immigration or mass deportations, I was a little bit uncomfortable with this, as it's a pretty radical thing to have to do. But I have to say, as a pollster, I've been shocked at how remarkably stable the polling has been on this all year. It runs from anywhere from 60% support amongst the public on most immigration related topics to it's in the 80s when you talk about criminal illegal aliens, as in people who have committed an additional crime once they've been here. And that to me is remarkable, even in the face of all this media coverage.
Right. I mean, and I'll say I'm just a lawyer, right? But I work with a lot of political clients. You'd know better than I do. The only place where there seems to be any erosion is in support for the specific tactics that are being engaged in Minneapolis. And that would be to be expected. I mean, poor woman who, again, I think she was used to ill effect, who lost her life. Of course, people don't like seeing that. But I also have been surprised that support for deportations generally continues to stay in that high 50s, low 60s range.
Yeah. Ultimately, I think one of the reasons why you see blue states and blue cities pushing back so hard is that this is a source of their political power. You have people who by bringing in all these extra people, the census currently, the way it works, requires us to count illegal aliens as part of those numbers. So then when we do redistricting, you get more political power, you get more representation in the Congress. So I think at least at some level, it's partly about that at the source of this. But then additionally, we saw in December, all of a sudden, issues that apparently more people knew about, but it just hadn't gotten much national attention. We have this massive scale of fraud that's being uncovered and people are finding out about. And lo and behold, within 2 weeks, as you know, and it's all also tied to immigration, some of it anyway, that we end up now with these local leaders, Tim Walz, who I wonder, I'd be curious if you think he has some legal issues. You have Mayor Fry, whose wife apparently worked for one of the law firms until like a month ago, the law firms that represented some of these organizations implicated in the fraud. And you have Keith Ellison, who also has, at least has been on tape apparently, sounding like he understood what was going on. So to me, it seems like partly what you have is these elected officials really wanting to distract away from this massive fraud.
Oh, I mean, look, that to me, it seems like there's no question that's, I mean, your point on the census is really well taken. And then on apparently the massive money spigot going into, I don't want to say like the whole Somali community, right, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, but some politically active portion of it for sure, right? And look, I mean, the incentives there. I'm sort of reminded about the screaming about what happened when USAID got shut down. And as a lawyer, Dustin, you've known me. Like I'm Mr. All these people are too incompetent to keep things secret like this. Conspiracies are really hard. Like I'm that boring guy. Yeah. I tell you what, sometimes you just have to be willing to raise your eyebrows and say, might be wrong about that. Might be really wrong about that, because I think the timing here is striking. And you asked about the Insurrection Act. I'll just, by the way, what a time to be alive. Like there's all sorts of laws that I've been reading, maybe for the first time since law school, and most of them are not the fun ones. Yeah. But what does the Insurrection Act, when people talk about that, you've got a smart audience, right? It's 10 U.S. Code Section 252, right? And that says that whenever the president considers that unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages make it impracticable to enforce the laws of the United States in any state by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings, he can federalize the National Guard or send in the active duty armed services in order to allow federal laws to be enforced. That's what you've got here, is at a bare minimum, you've got assemblages that are beginning to make it impractical to enforce immigration law in parts of Minneapolis.
Yep.
That's what the Insurrection Act is for. And by the way, I'd say it's there also. I think if it were invoked, it would be smart for the time being, because hopefully it would dissuade these folks from continuing to put their lives at risk for no good reason. Yeah. Unfortunately, I think the political leadership, that many of whose names you just mentioned, Dustin, in Minnesota, I think they want this because they think, at least in Minnesota, they can make hay with this. And, let's not forget, this, I know this, Minnesota is one of those rare states that is still sort of purpley. And it's actually one of the purple states that's been trending a little bit red. And I think that the Democratic establishment in Minnesota may say, what would fire up our base better than Trump invoking the Insurrection Act against Minnesota?
Yeah, and they get to say this nationally.
Right.
It's ultimately they caused it, but they'll say this is, democracy dies in darkness. This is, this is an attack on democracy. Obviously, they're the ones who are attacking currently our republic, because ultimately it is constitutional what the president's doing. We are enforcing federal law. To your point, this is a state that in much of the rural part is trending red. And you have Michelle Tafoya, who just announced her Senate campaign, a famous sports broadcaster, and has waded into politics. This is a state that I think there's opportunities. Clearly, we just watched the governor end his reelection bid because of the fraud, it seems. But I do think we're barreling towards Insurrection Act, and it does worry me about that would happen. I'd like to pivot real quick to the census and to redistricting, because that does bring up all of this. And
Every political lawyer loves talking about redistricting, especially now, because we used to think we only got to make money at this once every 10 years. Now it's apparently like all the time. It's great.
Well, there are certain people on the left in the last 15 years, 10 years. Eric Holder actually led one of the groups that really focused on this. It's partly why I think we've had a lot of these lawsuits in the middle of the decade for, Democrats have pushed to change lines. North Carolina, for instance, seems to change their lines every 5 minutes. And but we're waiting. I don't know when this is supposed to happen, but the Voting Rights Act, that the Supreme Court is looking at this issue. So if you can kind of explain to people what's going on with redistricting overall and what we might see happen from the Supreme Court. And then also, is it possible for us to not include illegal aliens in our census?
Boy, that's a big question. So let's talk about what's going on first. So as a lot of your viewers probably know, and we can go into more on this if you want. I don't want to cover some old territory, but the Supreme Court recently knocked out or really knocked the ability for states, or the requirement really for states under the Voting Rights Act, to have majority minority districts and to protect those. The Supreme Court basically said that the reasoning for having those it just isn't constitutionally sound. I happen to agree. Well, as a result, that means that a lot of southern states, including like North Carolina, have the ability to redraw their maps, or arguably need to redraw their maps, to eliminate districts that were drawn for racially motivated reasons, right? To keep a majority minority district. So that's been going on. As a lot of your viewers probably know, if you were to eliminate all majority minority districts in the South, you're probably talking about, a net gain for Republicans of 20 or so seats in the Congress. These days, that's a big deal. That's why blue states like California are losing it and saying, hey, we're going to redistrict to try and balance some of that out. Texas is trying to take advantage of it, and on the right, and California is saying, well, shoot, if they can do it, then we're going to redistrict for our own reasons. And they may or may not be able to do that. But the dirty secret for the left is that most blue states, like even California, which has some room to do more, Illinois, like New York, big blue states are already relatively highly gerrymandered in order to favor the Democratic Party. There's several red or reddish states that are not nearly so gerrymandered, either because of the Voting Rights Act, right? Or just frankly because of, traditional go along, get along niceness. And
we just saw that in Indiana, where they chose not to do anything.
100%.
Also.
And by the way, like, you can agree or disagree with it. Very principled. You could say the principle's outdated or it doesn't make sense right now. But it's that sort of principle on the side, and on the side of Republican legislators in many red states that are holding back probably another 15 or 20 Republican seats around the country.
Totally. Well, so I did an analysis based on the 24 election not too long ago, about 2 months ago. Right now, I would call it, the term I use is a gerrymandering advantage. So the Democrats right now have a +7 gerrymandering advantage over what their vote totals were in the 24 election. So that's actually that's a 14 seat swing in the House. So if they didn't have that, honestly, we'd actually have a pretty strong majority in the House right now if it actually mirrored what the Republican vote was nationally. So that's a pretty big deal. And then that's before you get into some of the other issues that you've talked about with the Voting Rights Act and how some of these states in the South would change in particular. So and then with the census in particular, that also, these three things were to change, how we count and reapportion districts. That would have, I wouldn't call it a permanent majority for Republicans, but there's a reason why. This is also what played into the 22 cycle, where people thought we're going to have a red wave. and it was a red trickle, it's partly because of this gerrymandering that's happened and having this gerrymandering advantage that it just doesn't play out as much in the actual districts and how the math works in the House.
So yeah, you're exactly right, and I'd say that 7-vote gerrymandering. Just you saying it, right? I don't know your methodology, but like you said, that sounds about right to me. Like that jives with, it's not like it's a crazy huge advantage, but right now with the country being so evenly divided, every bit matters. Yeah. And my plea, or maybe something I'd say to some Democratic friends who might be watching this is I'd say, look, like, by the way, eliminating at least the VRA seats, right? These racially gerrymandered seats. I actually think it will end up throughout the South making all seats marginally more competitive.
Totally, yeah.
It'll make them more competitive. And look, at the end of the day, we need to be able to talk to each other. Like one of the biggest problems we've got is everybody wants to live in a district where they have their blue representative or their red representative, and then they just, by the way, bitch about that person among themselves. But at least we don't have somebody from the other party. Like,
yeah, well, you get a lot of losers. Frankly, both parties have lazy people who never have to worry about an election ever again after they get elected.
It incentivizes, and this isn't obviously, we know this. I mean, we both know members of Congress who are fantastic, right? Who are the exceptions to this, but it incentivizes the person who that's the best job they could ever get.
Yeah,
okay, is member of Congress. That's not who the founders wanted in Congress. Was the person who's like, this would be the greatest thing I could ever do. I could live in Congress the rest of my life.
So is it legal? Like, how can we change how we count the districts?
Yes, I mean, I think you could. It may require, though, a Supreme Court case, and I think the birthright citizenship question that's going to be decided by the Supreme Court is going to play into this a little bit, because if it turns out that, I mean, obviously, the question of citizenship, right? I mean, we count all citizens, right? So it's, people may be saying, well, that's not 1-to-1. How does it matter? Here's how it matters. If the Trump administration can say, hey, look, like, you don't get birthright citizenship, just by being born here. Or if the Supreme Court says, well, the executive order doesn't work, but a law could do this, right? Which might be the outcome. Well, what that would tell me is the constitutional sort of assumptions that are behind we need to count everybody, no matter whether they're a citizen or not, would fall away.
Yeah.
And it would say, hey, look, pass a law that says here's how we're doing the census, and there's no requirement that you count every person, instead of you count every citizen, because it's true, citizens are the ones who are entitled to representation in the federal government. Non-citizens are not.
Yeah. Let's step back a little bit. I'd like to. One of my business partners in the polling firm, I believe you all knew each other from college Republicans back in the day. So,
can we mention your partner's name?
Yes, Lee Vacher.
Yeah, I remember Lee.
Yeah, so that I know that you've been a Republican for a while and you were involved. So what first got you involved in politics? Why did you get involved? What was it about it?
Honestly, I was a typical, like, self-important, turd when I was a young kid. Like, hey, boy, my opinions matter. And, I remember thinking, like, geez, if these guys in government, get all this money, like, maybe you ought to, like, pay attention to what they're doing with it. And, I think I was probably, basically, without knowing it, like a down the middle Democrat, when I was a younger kid. And got challenged both by my dad and some teachers I had to kind of look at some interesting things. And what I think solidified me as a Republican was fond memories of, I liked Reagan when I was a kid. I didn't really think of him as Republican or Democrat. I just thought of him as the president. And so fond memories of Reagan. And then a social studies teacher in the 11th grade had me do a report. We had to do a contemporary U.S. history report on an incident or issue from U.S. history that maybe people didn't know about. And he suggested the Chappaquiddick incident to me. And shout out to Scott Miller if you're out there, a good guy. But Mr. Miller said, you should look at this. I think you might find it interesting. And it blew my mind. Like, if you look into Chappaquiddick, like the level of, like, cover up, corruption, and human tragedy around that, and just the way that a human being was treated as disposable by one of the most powerful families in the country. that kind of made me say, like, geez, what the heck else goes on in politics?
Yeah.
And here I am wishing that I never knew.
And you probably have gotten through several layers of the onion over time. Well, so you're interested in politics. You go to college, you get involved with college Republicans. When did you decide the law?
Honestly, so that I thought, like, I decided it when I was in high school. Like I said, I was kind of a self-important kid. And so I thought, I'm really good at talking and arguing. I'll be a lawyer. Well, for me, it actually worked out because, I went to college. I liked college. I liked work. I got good grades, took the LSAT, did really well on that, and then thought, hey, I'm going to apply, see where I can get in. And I got in a lot of places and sort of had my choice. And I thought, I knew it. I'm so smart. I'm going to be a lawyer. Happily, like, then I got to law school and realized, like, oh, this is a lot of work. But also happily, I liked it. So I'm one of, I think, the rare guys who went straight through, who probably should have taken some time before I did. I mean, I graduated law school at 24. But I got lucky and I ended up loving it on the other side, right? We all hear about the stories of the people who go through, I have all this debt and now I hate it, right? I'm one of the lucky ones.
Yeah, a lot of people who call themselves reformed lawyers, they're doing something completely different.
I love doing the law. I wouldn't want to do anything else.
What is it about the law that you love?
Straight up, and this is going to sound so cliche, helping people, having the opportunity, like, to, we've worked together, I mean, usually when people are calling up a lawyer, it's not because it's like their greatest day ever, right? Now, sometimes, it's with candidates, they're running for an office that they believe in, they're super excited or whatever. But usually you have an opportunity to get into a foxhole with somebody and you really get to know them in that process. Yep. And usually you have an opportunity to help them out of a tough situation or through a tough situation. And that's just enjoyable as heck. I mean, most people, once you get to know them, most are really decent, good people. And you realize, like, we, to the moment in this country, right? We all have a hell of a lot more in common with each other than we don't, even at this time in history. And the lawyer-client relationship, I think, allows you to get to know somebody like that, maybe more than a lot of other areas of business. So that's probably that. And I got to say, I do love winning. And sometimes, when you pull one out or you think something up and then all of a sudden it's happening and that, like, started in your mind. Yeah, that's fun. It's gratifying.
Yeah, that makes sense. In many ways, it's kind of like, I guess, my career path of being a campaign manager, then being a general consultant. Yeah. You get to know people at a very intimate level. In some ways, you end up being like the third person in the marriage with but without any of the weird stuff. But their personal finances, everything in their background because you have to, and all the warts and everything. But then you also, winning is the whole point of the thing, and getting to make a difference. So you go from Harvard Law School, and then what was your first job in politics, and how did you get into, not politics, but in the law? And then how did you figure out, I would like to do political related legal issues, because most people aren't doing that?
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, there's more money in the law away from politics. If you've got other political lawyers watching this, they're probably, like, cracking their drink right now. They're like, I know that's true. But first job in the law was actually, it was actually an undergrad. I worked as a legal assistant to a law firm to try and figure out whether I really might want to do it. But after law school, my first job in the law was with a small firm a big firm up in Seattle. It was called Preston Gates and Ellis. It's now K&L Gates. But after 6 months, I left to go clerk for Judge Timkovich, who was then a new judge on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in Denver. Yeah. And when I left him, I went to a Globo mega firm called Hogan Lovells. I think they're now like AmLaw 5. They're absolutely massive. And I was doing business divorces, really not doing any political stuff. And I got into the political stuff really when Katie Biber-Chen, the general counsel to Mitt Romney, gave me a call and said, we knew each other from law school. And she said, you're in Colorado. Can you tell me how we get on the ballot out there? And that started a slow descent into what I am now.
Was that 2008 or 2012?
2008, and so that was volunteer in 2008. As you might remember, Romney won the preference election in Colorado in 2008. That was part of his sort of string of upsets that put McCain on the ropes there for a while. And in 2012, they came back to me to assist with what became like a much longer slog to the nomination. And then like my first full-time job in political law was I was deputy general counsel to that campaign after helping them in a bunch of states.
I think the first time that I really met you would have been in that interim between those two campaigns.
Yes.
I think with helping with election day operations. And election day operations is pretty important. So you were part of that. Eventually, I think you have been the main person for these efforts. I believe you were in 2014 when we did the campaign for governor.
Yeah, I ran election day operations in Colorado for the Republican Party, and I'm saying that like globally, right? From 2014, 16, 18, and 20.
Wow. So what's the main thing that any lawyer who might get tapped to do that would need to think about in putting it all together?
That's a great question. And also I'll say, like, a lot of times this starts out with a consultant who gets asked, what are we doing to get ready for that?
Yeah.
So the first thing to know about election day operations is you should be or voter protection. Democrats will typically call this voter protection. You need to be thinking about this like before the October of the election. You need to be thinking about it usually at the beginning, at a bare minimum, of the calendar year of the election. Why? Well, because all the rules that are going to affect the election are getting made at that time. So what you need to be thinking about is, one, what are the deadlines, right? What rules, election rules, regulations are getting made and who makes them? Two, when are my primaries, right? Because what you want to do is do dry runs of your EDO or your voter protection operation right then. And you want to use those primaries as opportunities to test out your network to see how it's going. Three, what do you want to be thinking about? If you've never done it before, find a lawyer or a consultant or a campaign manager who has.
Yeah.
Because this isn't rocket science, but there are pieces to doing it that are really important. Like, for example, having a bunch of stuff drafted if you have to go to a courthouse, like all of your legal papers ready, because, as you know, Dustin, if there's an emergency on election day or just before it, you don't have time to put all that stuff together. Like, it needs to be ready to go within an hour. And unless it's written ahead of time, you can't.
What would you say? So probably stepping back to what this actually is about, election day operations, at least on the Republican side, is the objective is to protect your candidates in the election so that funny business doesn't have them lose votes, or that rule changes don't screw them, or, they keep the polls open longer so that they can get more people through. Like, what would you say the ultimate objective when you're asked to do election day operations?
To make sure that every person who is entitled to vote, who can cast a legal ballot, may do so if they choose, and that ballot gets counted, right? Because I'll tell you right now, every candidate I've worked with, that's what they want, right? They just want a fair shake. And that's what election day operations is supposed to be about, is making sure that the election is contested fairly, right? And that nobody's putting a thumb on the scale for one side. And obviously, if you're representing a Republican candidate, you're making sure that nobody's putting a thumb on the scale for the Democratic candidate.
And that can show up in lots of different ways. It could be, fraud. It could be just rule changes. It could be, going to court for their other, they go to court. There was an issue with opening up a polling place in the morning for 5 minutes to open up late. The Democrats go to the court and say, we want to be able to have this polling place open for another 5 hours or something. And obviously that means that they can get people there after the polls are supposed to be closed and get
100%. I mean, our Democratic friends never want a polling place held open in an area where a lot of Republicans might show up to vote.
Though, does it happen the other way? I don't see Republicans doing that too often.
Well, look, I mean, as in the Democrats, God bless them, they love to say that Republicans are way ahead in election litigation, and they talk about Bush versus Gore, where Ben Ginsburg and his team down in Florida really did mop the floor with them. And that's true, right? But that's because in Bush versus Gore, everybody was inventing the machine right there. I mean, that's, that will never happen again because now each side gets it. And the Democrats got it way before we did, right? We won in 2000, and other than Ben and a couple others who were screaming, dude, we need to be ready for this all the time now. Other than, Republicans were like, it's fine, it'll be good. The Democrats immediately said, we're never going to get played like that again.
Well, something that's interesting. So because of Ben's work in 2000, then I'm working on the re-election campaign in 2004. My work in coalitions wasn't so important towards the end of the election because that's all stuff that you do earlier. So I moved into doing more election day operations. Now, one of the things I was shocked to find out at that time, and I do question Republicans back then for not having done more about it, I found out that there was you'll give me the right legal term for it, but an injunction on the Republican National Committee from being able to participate.
Yes. A consent decree
by a judge in New Jersey, who we had to wait for the guy to die to basically be able to do election day operations. But so we had to do it through weird kind of other organizations, volunteer type stuff. First thing, two things from that experience. One, I was shocked to find out that was the case. Two, I was shocked to find out the stuff that happens. Like, I think in that election for our colleagues in Pennsylvania, there was a case of some union thugs pushing one of the lawyers, a little guy. He was in a tough part of Pennsylvania. And he ultimately fled the polling location, and they followed him to a Home Depot parking lot. And these guys are big bruisers, and he's in a small rental car. And they surrounded him, and they actually turned his car over with him hanging in it. That was one thing that happened that election. We had a situation in Minneapolis, actually, not super surprising, where a group of folks were going polling place to polling place with on a bus and being handed out electric bills. And we didn't do anything other than try to let them know that we knew this was happening. There was no follow-up lawsuit or anything like that. That's all it was. It was just kind of like a cat and mouse game back then.
So on the consent decree, right? That finally lapsed in
2020, right before the election. Not enough time to actually do anything about it, but it.
Yep. But I mean, so even when I was on the Romney campaign, we had to run EDO through the campaign. The reason that was, the consultants who are watching this will get it. When you have to spend campaign hard dollars on doing voter protection or EDO, that every dollar you're spending on that in a campaign is dollars you can't spend putting actual lead on the target, right? So it was a massive structural disadvantage for Republican presidential campaigns.
And this is the thing that I think about back then. There had been a legal remedy. I just felt like now looking back on it, I just accepted it as this is the way it has to be. And this is a just world order where Republicans aren't allowed to do anything about this. Democrats can, but Republicans can't. How did we live in a world like that? It started in the early 80s, going to 2020. How did we live in a world where that was okay, we can do? That's crazy.
Well, I mean, going back to the 80s, you and I were both, twinkles in our father's eyes, right? But I mean, I'll say that the consent decree came out of New Jersey, and there were some tough facts there. Where some Reagan operatives were screwing around with transportation that was going to be used to get Democratic voters to the polls, and basically lied to them about where they had to go. And nobody should do that. That's not good, right? And I think the RNC entered into the consent decree figuring, we'll get over this in about 8 years. The problem is if you let the judge decide when it's over, which is what was in the settlement, the judge may decide it's never over. And so they tried to get out from under that consent decree 2 or 3 times, including, I think, just before the 2012 campaign, and it was just rejected every single time.
Now, did that go all the way to the Supreme Court, or how would that work? Was it a state judge, or was it a?
No, as a federal district judge, and I don't know if it ever made it up to the Supreme Court. I think it made it up to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals a couple times. And if it's a consent decree and the consent decree says it's his discretion, right, when it gets lifted, well, there's not much to appeal there.
It's just crazy. I mean, this affected generations of voters. People don't realize how important this was. As someone in charge of budgets for campaigns, nowadays I take it much more soberly, I guess. In the early days of my career, I hated to do it. I hated doing it. I wanted to spend all my money on TV and mail and everything else, as you said, with hard dollars. That's where I wanted to spend my time. Now I realize, and having a few more years and having seen some of the hairier sides of politics over the years, I now realize that it's actually it is a real problem depending on where you are. It's not the same everywhere. In Minnesota, I was shocked to see the level of activity that happens in the Twin Cities. Did not expect that. In the South, you see this happen in some places. It's a long-standing tradition. But anyway, it definitely, we were fighting with one hand tied behind our back for a very long time. And the media and voters, I don't think, ever knew that this was the case.
No, and the truth is, right now, people are a lot more interested in political process, right? Like, look, man, even back in 2012, a process story on how the Romney campaign has to pay for its election day operations while the DNC is doing it for Obama, nobody cared.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to fast forward to why you started First and 14th, because it's probably one of the more important cases that you've been involved in. You can tell me if that's right or wrong, but obviously historic nature, and how you ended up and how the law profession and politics and all that's changed over the years, because that is ultimately why you created this firm.
Yeah, I mean, so folks watching this probably know that there's been a proliferation of conservative boutiques, right? First and 14th is certainly one of those. Well, why? I was a comfortable big law partner. I was at a very large law firm, before forming this firm. A firm, by the way, that I still love. But what happened was in 2022, your listeners will remember the January 6th Select Committee. The RNC cooperated with the January 6th Select Committee, but then one day they got a call from Salesforce, their data vendor. I know a lot of campaigns use Salesforce. And Salesforce said, hey, we got this subpoena from the J6 Select Committee for basically all your data from November 2020 to January of 2021. And as you might remember, there were 2 Senate specials in Georgia in January of 2021. So the data from November through January would have presidential data, and then also a lot of strategic and fundraising data related to those January special elections. Which
basically means all the data.
It means everything, okay? And so with that data, anybody who knew what they were doing would have been able to recreate all sorts of things about how the RNC does business, but especially their small dollar fundraising operation, which, as you know, Dustin, is legendary. So RNC called me up and said, hey, we need help defending against this congressional subpoena. The firm I was at approved it. As soon as we filed our emergency lawsuit to stop Salesforce from providing those documents, that weekend, my firm had a lobbying practice, and several large lobbying clients got calls at home from news reporters who had been tipped off, right? And they got the question of, do you think it's malpractice that your law firm is suing these prominent Democratic members of Congress when Congress is working on this bill that you're lobbying on, and they might say no to that? Don't you see a conflict of interest there? So that resulted, as you might imagine, in some panicked communications at my old place. And I had to take a leave of absence. I had to go and hang a shingle with a friend's shop, shout out to Statecraft Law. And happily, we ended up winning the case. We said, hey, the First Amendment does not permit Congress to subpoena this information without a compelling government interest, because your listeners may be interested to know, political parties, there's a recognized First Amendment right not just to keep their member lists secret, but also to keep deliberative process, internal strategy, and memoranda secret, because you can't. What's the point of a political party? Winning elections. How can you win elections if the other side can just subpoena your strategic information and then put it out for the public to see? So after we won, I went back. But the long story short is, when I got back and I talked to my team, Dustin, I told them the vulnerability at a big firm is just too much now, and we're going to have to go do something like this.
So ultimately, that's one example of how it's changed if you're doing this kind of work. So how would you say it's different between Republican lawyers and Democrat lawyers?
Well, I mean, look, the Democrat lawyers, and God bless them, I bump into them all the time. The vast majority of them work in one law firm. They work at the Elias Law Group. And, they used to work at Perkins Coie until it turned out that Mark Elias was essentially laundering money, right, that's what it was, like to fund the Steele dossier and not have it show up on a campaign finance report. I think, but now they're almost all of them are in the Elias Law Group. That's different. On the right, I don't think anybody on the right would trust a single law firm to have that kind of power. And by the way, like, thumbs up to that. I would not want my law firm to be in that position where you've got all these competing Republican interests coming through the door. No. So on the right, we tend to be in smaller shops with a couple exceptions. And frankly, on the right, what all the lawyers say to each other is, hey, are you thinking about, if they're at a big firm, when we hear about somebody else thinking about starting another boutique, you think like, oh no, that's more competition. I say, no, that's fantastic, because there's so many conflicts and there's so much work to be done on this side. Like, we need a more robust legal ecosystem on the legal political right, because I think there's strength in that kind of diversity and in those kind of.
So what are the kind of cases that these boutiques and like you all are taking up? What are the sorts of things? Because it does seem like it's a growing industry, and there's a lot of stuff just happening, from if it's the Biden administration and they're doing all the executive orders, to it's the Trump administration, they're doing all the executive orders, because that's the world we're in. Congress doesn't work, so everything has to happen that way. So there's that side of it too. We have all the redistricting stuff, and there's challenges here and there, to just regular, getting a campaign started, outside groups, all this stuff. Like, what are all things?
Yeah. So obviously, most of these firms, including mine, we obviously do the campaign stuff and all that. That's there's nothing boring about that. It's super fun, but that's sort of the basement level stuff. The fun stuff that we get to do is, things like creative lawsuits, against, blue states who are adopting regulations. Like, for example, we have a case in New York where New York's been trying to make a community of nuns pay for abortifacients, right? And contribute to the state healthcare program where that's, provided for everybody. And these nuns who have no money because all they do is take care of people who are dying of cancer, they just can't do that. And it will drive them out of the state if they can't do it. So we'll take cases like that, right? Because it's a civil rights case and we can win that and get our attorney's fees paid. We'll work for mostly red state attorneys general. For example, this is public. I was hired by the state of Kansas to defend them against a lawsuit by the Elias Group when they banned foreign money from their constitutional question elections. And by the way, it turns out that Mark Elias had a Swiss billionaire who was pouring money into Kansas's constitutional elections, and so he sued over it. So red state AGs who don't have expertise in this stuff, not because their lawyers aren't great, but just because they don't see these issues that much, we'll do that sort of stuff. We'll also do fun stuff like, suing on behalf of, I represent all three major Republican committees. So where a Secretary of State does something crazy, like recently Adrian Fontes in Arizona allowed what used to be the No Labels Party in Arizona to change its name to, I swear to you, Dustin, this is what they changed it to, the Arizona Independent Party. Okay. Who wouldn't want to join the Arizona Independent Party? And so, when the RNC had to sue down there, they hire us for that sort of stuff. And we can do it because we don't have conflicts on the other side where we're asking Adrian Fontes for favors.
Makes sense. So one of the things that this has become much more competitive, and it probably works for Mark Elias and all of them being banded together. I wonder how this works with the boutiques. There's and I assume that they probably represent all the different Soros groups as well. I mean, you mentioned one of the billionaires that, that they're getting funded. It makes sense. I wonder if they're getting money from Singham, the guy who's the communist who lives in China but is an American billionaire. I'm sure they make they get everybody's money probably over there. But there's this group, the 65 Project, targeting, it's one of the many Soros constellations, it appears, and they target Republican lawyers. Like, how has this all affected the legal profession for Republican lawyers?
Yeah, I mean, look, the 65 group, they say, hey, we're just targeting the lawyers who filed one of the 65 lawsuits challenging election results in 2020. And by the way, like, hey, look, if a lawyer lies, if a lawyer violates their oath, that's all fair game, man. I mean, like, you get into this profession, you got to play by the rules. But the 65 Project is trying to weaponize the bar complaint process against conservative attorneys. And of course, you have to think about it. And look, like, you do something like that, and this is more broadly speaking, like, whether it's Soros or whoever, folks funneling money into groups like this ought to really think twice, because every one of them is gradually attacking some bulwark of a civilized society and politicizing.
I mean, this is the actual attacking democracy.
It is. So you just, that's literally what I was about to say, Dustin, is like, you say you want to attack democracy, keep attacking the rules that support our society and make everything political, right? The whole idea, the process is the punishment, right? Look, if you get a bar complaint filed against you in many states, Colorado actually happily is not a state that's like this, but in many states, you've instantly got to notify your malpractice carrier. You've instantly got to begin defending yourself. It takes time away from your practice. It stresses you the hell out. And you know what it says? Why am I doing these political cases? And that's the goal of the 65 Project and groups like it, is to get lawyers like me, right, to say, you know what, the juice ain't worth the squeeze. Because as I joked about at the start, right, hey, I could make more money doing business divorces, or venture capital fights, right? Why not go do that? Well, the reason why not go do that is because, look, like, if our electoral system doesn't work, right, if one side of the political debate can't get competent counsel, well, then there's no fair fight here. That's the reason why people do what I do on our side. By the way, I think there's some principled Democrats who think the same way on their side, and good for them. I wouldn't want somebody starting something like the 65 Project to go after Democratic lawyers, but I'll tell you what, if it keeps up,
it's going to have to. It's unfortunate. It's if you don't have some sort of response, they'll just continue going in that direction. The last estimate I'd seen, I don't know what's actually true, but it's something around 500 to 600. That was like 2 years ago I saw that. So who knows how much it is. I think a lot of them are people who were part of just EDO, election day operations, volunteer. Just happen to be a Republican who does probably do just whatever kind of law, but shows up to help out the party in the final days to do this kind of stuff. And of course, they're going to be possibly on challenges to something or other around the election, because that's what you do. And then they get targeted.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I know a lawyer who one of these was filed against, who, by the way, his name was on exactly one lawsuit. And for the record, it was meritorious. I won't mention the state, because he didn't agree to have me talk about this, but I'll just say, like, it was a lawsuit that when in that state, it legitimately looked like the election might be 1,000 or 2,000 votes statewide, could have potentially flipped the election. And you know what he did when once it looked like that gap was going to be wider? He dismissed the lawsuit. Exactly what a lawyer should do, because he had to tell the court, look, this isn't possibly going to change the outcome anymore. So in that state, you're required to inform the court of that. He did exactly what he was supposed to do. By the way, the bar complaint was dismissed. It went nowhere. But the level of stress for that person, it was shameful. So,
absolutely,
when you lump those people in, right, with those who actually did say crazy things and lie to courts, you do a disservice to the whole process, and you make people think that it's all political. And frankly, it lets the charlatans hide on our side.
That's absolutely right. Well, if people want to work with First and 14th, what should they do?
They should pay us a retainer. No, I'm kidding. So they can find me. So I'm not on any social media. That's just a long-standing thing. So they can go to our website, www.first-14th.com. My bio's on there. My partners are all on there. It's very easy to find our contact information. Give us a call. We will answer. We'll talk to you. And we're happy to work with folks all over the country. We already do.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for shedding light on a lot of important topics, and we look forward. Maybe we'll have you back sometime soon.
Hey, Dustin, it's a pleasure. Great to talk to you, and thanks for having me on. Well,
that was Chris Murray, lawyer extraordinaire with First and 14th. As he said, you can go to first-14th.com to check them out. And if you need legal advice on anything, probably, but constitutional issues, election issues, issues of new legal questions where no one's ever really tapped into them. He's also somebody who can help with that. And so anyway, definitely appreciate Chris joining us today and shedding light on a lot of topics. If you like the show, the way to help us out is to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you enjoy podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever it is. Do follow us. It makes a difference. And if you'd like to learn more about our polling at American Pulse, and you'd like to help determine who and what we're polling, you can go to pollingclub.com, sign up for our new free community, or you can join the premium, which is very affordable. But thank you very much for everybody who's already done that. We just launched it in the last couple weeks, so thank you for that. Thank you for joining us today. This has been another episode of Political Trade Secrets.
Join us next time by subscribing on iTunes and get show notes and sign up for our newsletter at politicaltradesecrets.com.